Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats or lawyers in negotiating peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by PILPG Senior Peace Fellow and the chair of PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors, Ambassador Zorica Maric Djordjevic. Welcome, Zorica.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Zorica's career in diplomacy spans over 40 years. It includes roles of the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for Montenegro, the head of the permanent mission of Montenegro to the World Trade Organization, Ambassador of Montenegro to the UN Human Rights Council, Special Envoy of the Prime Minister and President of Montenegro to the United States, and the head of the Montenegro Trade Mission in Washington, D.C. Zorica chairs the PILPG Circle of Former Ambassadors to the United Nations Human Rights Council, coordinating this group of former ambassadors who regularly weigh in on changing events that impact human rights and global peace. In today's conversation, we will draw upon Zorica's impressive career in public service and diplomacy. Thank you for joining us, Zorica. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too, Paul.
Well, let's kick it off with the very first question. Zorica, you were the Montenegrin trade representative during the time of Yugoslavia's dissolution. You were essentially the de facto ambassador to the United States and played a crucial role in American support for Montenegro and its eventual recognition as an independent state. You then went on to serve as the Montenegrin ambassador to the UN Human Rights Committee and the World Trade Organization. Can you share with us a little background about these various roles?
Sure, Paul, I will try. These roles cover over 30 years of my professional career, from 1989 through 2020. And those were the years of significant political instability and crucial geopolitical changes in Eastern Europe, with the end of communist era, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the tragic bloody breakup of former Yugoslavia, and then a prolonged, challenging political and diplomatic battle of Montenegro to build the case for independence and eventually renew its independence, becoming 192nd member of the UN in 2006 and sealed its security as the 29th member of NATO in 2017. So Montenegro has gone through significant changes with a great deal of disruptive influence and historical achievements. And I lived and worked in a kind of a shatter belt zone. In geology, it stands for scatter zones out of places of earthquake occurrences. In geopolitics, shatter belts are regions, countries, recognized and analyzed as profoundly internally divided, endangered by local tensions and conflict. So that was the Balkans of the 20th century, and at the turn of 21st century, overwhelming for one lifetime and more so for one professional career. So when I think of these different positions that you listed in the context of independence of Montenegro that really marked my diplomatic career, I think of them not as examples of an individual experience, but experiences broader and deeper than would fit in one diplomatic career. Besides, these positions account for the experience of female public servant, female diplomat, and reports of non-Western diplomat as well. So in that time frame, I had two foreign service careers, one as the special envoy and the chief overseas advisor for the government of Montenegro in Washington, D.C., and the other as the career diplomat in Geneva, Switzerland, two entirely different diplomatic destinations and quite different diplomacies. Bilateral with the US, Montenegro's key ally and partner. I worked in various roles during 3 US presidents, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. I want to make sure you understand that being a special envoy of Montenegro, which was still not a recognized country, meant working as a diplomat without diplomatic status in the host country, basically a lobbyist. That additional challenge explains one of the Senator Bob Dole comments on my work, one women army working through thick and thin in Washington, D.C. My second full-fledged diplomatic assignment was working in Geneva from 2013 through 2018 in the headquarters of the UN for Europe, with 47 multilateral institutions taking over Montenegro's first ever active membership in the UN institutional work as one of 47 members of the Human Rights Council, and the first ambassador and head of Montenegro mission to the WTO, World Trade Organization, another uncharted territory as Montenegro was just accepted as the new 164th member, and WTO is an institution that is not part of the UN system, but represents a government's intergovernmental organization, and governments use the organization to establish, revise, and enforce the rules that govern international trade in cooperation with the United Nations system, of course.
So, Zorica, let's pick up a little bit on your time in Washington, D.C. As you noted, Senator Bob Dole had said you were a one-woman army advocating for the recognition of Montenegro and for peaceful resolution of the conflict in Yugoslavia. And I witnessed your expertise and your dedication firsthand as we worked together on a number of these issues in a very complex political environment, not only in Washington, D.C., but globally. Can you shed some light on your approach to conducting this mix of diplomacy, negotiation, and advocacy on behalf of basically a new country?
Absolutely, Paul. Thank you for that question. I can talk about pre-independence period from 1995 to 2006 in Washington, D.C. that you mentioned in your question. So diplomatically, our direct bilateral engagement with the US government at that time started from scratch. Let me just remind you, our listeners, that the United States established diplomatic relations with Montenegro back in 1905, following its 1878 independence. After World War I, Montenegro was subsumed into the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens, and US-Montenegro diplomatic relations ceased to exist in 1920. The United States, of course, reestablished diplomatic relations with Montenegro in 2006, following the dissolution of the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. Now, how that happened, how we crossed that bridge, becoming again a member of the family of the sovereign nations, and what was the role of the official Washington in that process? On the eve of the Dayton Peace Agreement in November 1995, Djukanovic paid the first official visit to the United States. After that first visit, it was apparent, it was evident that we needed to step up our presence in DC. No single country became independent without being supported and embraced by Washington. Indeed, a comprehensive strategy for bilateral relations was developed, including the decision of the government of Montenegro to open the first trade mission in September 1996, followed by a series of bilateral visits of governments and parliaments officials to DC. I recall the first meeting with John Kornblum, who was Assistant Secretary of State at that time, who was already renowned diplomat known for negotiating the Helsinki Final Act and was soon to become a special envoy for the Balkans, 1995-1997. During that meeting in his office, he asked Djukanovic to show him on the map what part of Serbia was Montenegro.
Oops.
It was evident that we needed to start with basic geography. Or my first individual meeting at the State Department with Matthew Palmer in 1997. Matthew is now Deputy Ambassador, US Ambassador in London. When I insisted on adding missing Montenegro to the list of Yugoslav republics hanging on the wall next to his office door, there was a piece of paper and Montenegro was missing. And later, through the regular briefings, advocating and convincing first James Swigert, then Larry Ross, then Tom Countryman as advisors and later directors of the Office of South Central European Affairs, that Montenegro has its own vision, policies, and aspirations different from Milosevic's, and that they need to assign the first desk officer to Montenegro. This person would oversee Montenegro and report on it, which eventually happened. Putting Montenegro on the radar screen of the State Department was an essential part of my assignment. So what else? Most of my work as the special envoy of Montenegro was focused on the US Congress. And Polo Montenegro is a rare example of a foreign policy in which Congress had the upper hand, dominance. This is currently the case with Ukraine, but in a different, unfortunately negative context. In 90% of foreign policy, the president and executive branch here in Washington, D.C. had the upper hand. But Montenegro was an example because one of my tasks was to solicit US aid, financial and economic support to Montenegro at the time of prolonged international economic sanctions against Yugoslavia. And that required money, and money comes from the US budget. And the US budget was, and still is, right in the wheelhouse of Congress. So few critical Republicans were willing to back up Montenegro's request in providing that essential support, reversing dependence on Belgrade gradually. They put earmark for Montenegro in the foreign aid bill, which meant the exact amount of money that executive branch, that is State Department, USAID, Agriculture Department, Defense Department, had to allocate for support and projects in Montenegro. That was when I signed the first bilateral agreement between the two countries in April 1999. I was the liaison with the US Congress. That was essential to coordinate that support from Washington, D.C. On the State Department side, this work was closely coordinated with, as I mentioned, Ambassador Robert Gelbart, but then Ambassador James Dobbins, who took over when Ambassador Gelbart went as ambassador of US in Indonesia, if I remember well. Also, Ambassador William Taylor, and many of the policymakers and experts at the USAID, an amazing team, including Assistant Administrator Donald Presley, Gloria Steele, which later became the first woman acting administrator of USAID, Carl Mazzino, Sarah Farnsworth, an amazing team. So if we have time, I would just like to lay out what we accomplished with this support. So from 1999 to 2003, Montenegro received around $300 million in grants. 130 million US dollars were the direct balance of payment support for pensions, import of electricity, gasoline, and oil, import of medicine, and investments in several feasibility studies in preparation for some significant privatization and business investments attractions, such as aluminum combine, breweries, some central tourist locations to attract business investments. This generous USAID was structured to help the country's transition, but it really helped its economic and political survival, and I would say even biological survival of 600,000 people of Montenegro, together with Israel and Egypt. That's something that I heard very often at that time from USAID officials. So together with Israel and Egypt, Montenegro was the country with the US most extensive financial support per capita after the Second World War. I would probably, Paul, add South Korea. And this support diverted the potential conflict in Montenegro and strengthened resilience and confidence in a sustainable peace. So I would say 3D approach to US international engagement. You would remember, comprising of defense, diplomacy, and development. The trio presented, I think, in the Bush administration, worked well in the case of Montenegro and paved the way for Montenegro's independence and membership into NATO, but more importantly, peace. So Montenegro really was and is a success story in the US policy, and unfortunately, you don't hear much about that. Another, and I will finish off my work in Washington, D.C., was my close collaboration with NGOs, particularly National Endowment for Democracy and its arm, NDI. Outstanding support of the Balkan Action Council and then Public International Law Policy Group and Professor Williams as special advisor to the Office of President was instrumental during this transition, including Montenegro's negotiations on the union with Serbia and constitutional reforms after the independence. So to conclude, Paul, it was a sustained effort on the part of the country under international sanctions, without institutional traditional diplomatic power. I did not have diplomatic status until 2007, after independence. It was diplomacy without national or interagency dialogue like you have in the regular line of work when conducting foreign policy, or something you call a State Department legal advisor to guide the diplomats through the legal procedures and instructions. It was particularly challenging to work in DC at the time when the US was at the war with Belgrade, when parts of Montenegro were hit during the NATO bombing campaign. 8 civilians were killed, with over 100,000 refugees in the country of 600,000 people and scarce resources. It was indeed a miracle, when I think of that, to conduct day-to-day positive diplomacy, make a difference, and navigate through crisis diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy at the same time, and build a case for independence and cooperation with the host country to raise awareness of decision makers, both in Congress and the administration, of feasibility and credibility of the idea of sovereign Montenegro. So that's briefly, what my work was like.
No, thank you for that, Zorica. It's very helpful because we all study and think about how entities become independent states, but there's a lot of diplomacy and engagement that goes on both behind the scenes and publicly. And it was really great to get that detailed story about how that happens and how there can be a multifaceted or multidimensional collection of allies that help an entity become a state. Now, Zorica, after you succeeded in helping Montenegro navigate the Yugoslav conflict, navigate global politics to become independent, you were then tasked with helping Montenegro navigate becoming a member of NATO. This in 2007, this request from the president and prime minister landed on your desk. How did you go about representing Montenegro's aspirations and initiative to become a member of NATO?
Well, that's really the second part of my full-fledged engagement in Washington, D.C. But after independence, right away, I embarked unexpectedly on a pro bono international assignment in Sierra Leone as a long-term observer for the first free democratic elections after 12 years of the brutal civil war in the troubled country. And later in South Sudan, where I led a mission of PLPG in Juba. I'm very grateful for that assignment, Paul. South Sudan was ready to prepare for a peaceful referendum for independence. So for the first time, I worked in a different environment, but with countries with similar challenges to the one that my country went through. Not many people know how Montenegro influenced the referendum of the independence of South Sudan. So these adventures are certainly, professional adventures are certainly worthwhile, another story of the podcast, but they really helped me better prepare for my next assignment in Washington, D.C., another area of bilateral cooperation with the USA, defense cooperation. As the first defense attaché ad interim for 8 months, and then senior defense advisor of the government with a focus on military reforms and collaboration with the defense industry, all aimed at bringing Montenegro closer to the NATO. I was the only woman in the Washington, D.C. Association of Foreign Defense Attaché. Picture this scene. I remember my first meeting in this capacity in November 2007 when I walked into the Department of Defense main conference room, where the average age on the line was about 50 to 60, all very mature, well-experienced people in defense, and all men in military uniforms. I was the only woman, civilian, and I decided to start by just listening and sitting with each of them and asking questions. What are you doing? What do you like about it? What drives you to do a better job? How can we together do better? So it was a precious experience. It allowed me to visit major military bases and meet fantastic leaders like Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, Admiral James Stavridis, commander of South Command at that time. Later, he became chief commander of US NATO forces in Europe, and I met him again in 2012. I worked closely with General Steve Blum, chief of the National Guard Bureau, under then deputy commander of Northern Command, who managed a state partnership program between different former East European countries and United States. We set up a state partnership program between Maine and Montenegro, which has endured until now. That was a quite unique experience, not without challenges, because a woman and breaking a glass ceiling within the most powerful defense and policy attaché association was exciting, but also challenging. The work product of that assignment was coordinating and negotiating a critical project through political and business negotiations, a deal with Raytheon Canada and Raytheon United States, one of the leading, of course, defense companies, for Montenegro's first coastal surveillance system based on advanced technologies, including logistics, installation, and the training of personnel. The system became entirely operated in October 2013 and started in Port of Bar. As a necessary standard, the system was critical in advancing defense cooperation between two countries, Montenegro and the United States, but also between Montenegro and NATO. It was part of the final positive review of the action plan that led to membership in NATO in 2017. So it was another important part in building close cooperation with the Atlantic Council, also, and coordinating a team to advocate for Montenegro's membership in NATO in DC. So that really was accomplished in 2017. So I would say it was another mission accomplished.
So Zorica, you had changed your hat from being a diplomat to a military attaché with an entirely new portfolio and helped Montenegro, or lead the initiative for Montenegro to become a member of NATO. You then changed your hat again and became the ambassador to the UN Human Rights Committee, as well as the ambassador to the World Trade Organization. And you had just as you had in Washington, D.C., a very small staff, you had a very small staff in Geneva. Tell us about your experiences there and how you managed to go from the bilateral relationship to multilateral, both human rights and trade?
That was also very complex, and I must put it in a historic context, so please bear with me. When I was posted as ambassador of Montenegro to the UN and WTO in January 2013, the responsibilities could not have been more immense, more bigger. Montenegro was, for the first time, member of the UN Human Rights Council and the new recently admitted member to the WTO. So I had to think creatively to cover the hectic and very diverse schedule in these two multilateral organizations with only one part-time additional diplomat and no institutional history of any previous diplomatic experience in the country as a member of the UN Human Rights Council and WTO in Geneva. So working on both sides of the aisle in Geneva in such a huge organizations at the UN and WTO, I also realized that I needed to find my niche and find it meaningful for my country and the organization. So my work was really focused on gender issues, transitional justice, peace negotiation, and support for the post-conflict countries, integration into international trade and accession to WTO. How did I do that? Based on my minister's support, and I'm always grateful to Minister Igor Lukšić for giving me that platform to provide and reach out to the Secretariat of the Human Rights Council and to Public International Law and Policy Group. In support of these two organizations, we created the most effective representation of the Human Rights Council, and I am forever thankful to PLPG team members, Kate Behus and Becca Federers, for their contribution to some of the most significant initial achievements of Montenegro in Human Rights Council. A resolution on Sri Lanka that for the first time established the obligations of the government to report on the progress of war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly against Tamils during the final months of civil war in 2009. And the resolution and appointment of the first rapporteur on LGBT and Q issues, and the establishment of Gender Champion Group at the Human Rights Council, a network that really transcended Geneva and became part of UN headquarters in New York. So, and also Montenegro was at that time the first country that was a project that was granted to Montenegro, with the first country within the UN system to consolidate the digital register of all 6 UN bodies' recommendations for our government and other agencies, making monitoring the recommendations and reporting on results easier. In addition to WTO side, my support from PLPG was brilliant Jonathan Vorboys. And with his support, my small mission provided prominent participation in the trade policy review process and a number of new negotiations, fundamentally important activities running through the work of the WTO. I also collaborated closely with the European Union, and as a result of that, the European Union nominated me and was then appointed as of course, a Montenegrin representative by the WTO General Council as the chairperson of the working group for trade and transfer of technology, one of the 12 permanent working bodies of WTO. So managing responsibility was multitasking, exciting, and what I call a multi-blender for my brain and well-being.
Well, it sounds like you definitely had an exciting and impactful time while you were in Geneva. I want to pick up on that and dive a little bit deeper into some lessons learned. So you've been deeply involved in negotiation process, at the World Trade Organization and the Human Rights Council, in negotiating with the Americans and other NATO member states to bring Montenegro along the path to NATO membership. What did you learn about building consensus, about pulling together divergent views? Basically, what lessons can you share with our listeners about how to get to yes?
Very important question, because building consensus really is evolving in theory, but also in a practice. I cannot think of better example than a well-crafted international consensus of Montenegro on one of the critical points during this Washington time, building a case for independence and for closer ties with the US, but also international community. It was a critical turning point when we built international consensus on the currency reform of Montenegro back in 1999. While still part of the rump Yugoslavia, Montenegro dumped the Yugoslav dinar as the legal tender and replaced it with the mighty German mark in late 1999. Then President Milo Đukanović engineered this dramatic, daring, and risky move, which the United States and its allies finally and eventually supported. But building consensus for that support was an exciting path and story. I was part of the delegation that presented our case for currency reform on November 4th, 1999 in Washington, D.C. The delegation led by Đukanović briefed First Deputy Secretary of State Talbot, Defense Secretary William Cohen, and most importantly, the Department of Treasury, led by, at that time, Larry Summers and Michael Foreman. Michael Foreman later became a U.S. Trade representative, and we met in Geneva. The most challenging meeting was, of course, with Larry Summers, convincing him of Montenegro's capacity to manage the potential risk was difficult. It was an early meeting. I think it was Wednesday, early in the morning, and Secretary Summers was relaxed, having, I guess, his usual coffee and a cookie, expecting a relatively normal end of the week, at least for Treasury Department standards. And suddenly he learned that he had to deal with another unpredictable news from the troubled region. Đukanović wanting to introduce German mark and to start a comprehensive currency reform for the country. With the help of Senator Steve Sims and Trent Lott, immediately after that meeting, we arranged a meeting at the US Capitol, where our delegation also made a case for Montenegro's currency reform. The members of Congress in attendance were Trent Lott, Steve Sims, of course, Richard Lugar, John Warner, Harry Reid, Larry Craig, and Kay Bailey Hutchison, among others. They understood and warmly received our message. As a result of that, the United States ended up supporting Montenegro's currency reform. So Congress again had a decisive influence on the executive branch, overcoming factors that fueled kind of resistance during the initial negotiations in Washington, D.C. After this, it was easier to reach a consensus on the other side of the Atlantic with Germany and Bundesbank, Deutsche Bank, regarding what had already been a prepared logistic operation. So one daring and decisive move, carefully crafted consensus and coordinated international action with the support of, again, critical ally, the US. So Montenegro granted the mighty German mark legal tender status, providing not only needed financial stability, but I think that was crucial to put Montenegro on a course towards independence. And if I had time, Paul, I would like also to give you another example.
Oh, sure, of course.
Which was negotiating the UN support, United Nations support, for a massive influx of refugees from Kosovo during the NATO intervention. I received, it was 1999, of course, March, April, I received detailed documentation prepared by the Montenegrin Ministry of Foreign Affairs in cooperation with International Red Cross. I had a series of briefings in Washington and New York, supported by the Permanent Mission of Slovenia to the UN. I conducted negotiations with the office of Sergio de Mello, a Brazilian diplomat and the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Corps. After presenting our case, I was told that Montenegro and Kosovo are not two countries. Consequently, These people are internally displaced persons under the UN protocol, and they are not refugees, and they are not eligible for the UN support. So, but I didn't give up. I left a message for D'Amelio and then worked directly with him to find a solution. Finally, based on some historical precedent and also on Resolution 1244, he issued a green light for the UN humanitarian engagement in Montenegro. So getting his attention to this particular case was instrumental in finding the legal justification for the needed support. Unfortunately, D'Amelio was killed in Iraq in 2003, and he was missed dearly in the US system as a whole. Of course, Paul, we can talk about the referendum for independence of Montenegro. That's top to bottom consensus building internationally and domestically, but that story alone is probably worthwhile for a special edition of your podcast.
No, I do remember that time of the Montenegrin referendum and the negotiations with the Americans, the Europeans, the Council of Europe. It could fill up an entire podcast on its own. Let's pivot a little bit to gender and negotiations. You mentioned that one of your areas of interest and expertise was in the gender dimension of foreign affairs, public policy, and negotiations. And I was wondering if you could spend a little bit of time walking us through your approach to taking a gendered view of negotiations and how that has played out.
Thank you, Paul, for that question. There are actually two periods related to gender issues in peace negotiations and peace building. And you are familiar with the details, one before and one after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325. 31st October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And for the first time in the history of the UN, women's concerns about peace and security were formally discussed and acknowledged within the Security Council. While previous resolutions contained broad calls for the protection of civilians, Resolution 1325 was distinct in that it recognized the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women and stressed the need for full participation of women as active agents in peace and security. And the resolution was a landmark, whereas previously gender equality had been recognized as development issue, just development. The adoption of this resolution now firmly placed it within the realm of peace and security. And gender-responsive peace building and peace negotiation focuses on how conflicts affect people differently depending on their sex, age, ethnicity. It addresses gender-specific implications and concerns, as well as particular recovery and protection needs, if any. So ultimately, the resolution is about making the invisible visible, but opening spaces and dislodging obstacles to women's participation in decisions around conflict and peace did not and have not been solved entirely with this resolution. Obviously, we need more time. Many obstacles persist for women seeking to influence their design and implementation, and this includes difficulties with accessing talks, achieving equal influence at talks, raising issues of concern, and achieving material gains for women as an outcome of the peace process. I will start and give you an example from my region, and you witnessed some of those. The Dayton Peace Agreement, which ended 1992-1995 war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, negotiated at the Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, Ohio, 5 years before the adoption of the UN Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. The agreement is viewed as the tremendous diplomatic achievement of the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and the Clinton administration, but almost no women were involved in the negotiation process, except those in administrative roles. Aida Hodžić an analyst and advocate for women's issues in the region, called Dayton a series of locker room stories, commenting, "I could simply not believe the absence of women was so obvious in the way that the arrangement was negotiated." So Dayton centered peace only on issues of ethnicity and territory dispute, although the prevalence of wartime sexual violence against women during the conflict was very much present. So similarly, women did not participate in the European Union facilitated Belgrade-Pristina dialogue process in 2002, and I don't know if later they've been included, not that I can think of. Then during the 2 terms of Prime Minister Vujanovic, Montenegro did not have a single woman as the minister to shape the decision-making in time of war and peace in the region. So representation is the key. It is the starting point.
Well, Zorica, let's take that experience and that perspective, and let's dive a little bit more deeply into, let's say, the World Trade Organization. In your time at the World Trade Organization, what did you observe in terms of the impact that the WTO policies, directives, decisions have on women's issues and women's role in trade and in peace?
It's a similar kind of an experience, except that working simultaneously on those two issues, on these issues at the UN and WTO, for me, it became apparent that they are deeply interconnected. How the trade impacts women, findings that trade rules are not gender neutral, unlocking trade for women's empowerment and women and security. It also became clear that unlike the UN, WTO does not explicitly mention peace in its documents. And that was surprising for me, because after World War II, with all its devastating destruction on the nations, trade for peace decisively guided community building throughout the developed world, throughout from European community. Before that, of course, general agreement on tariffs and trade. So it all really was a wartime planning to provide a global economic order to rebuild world economy, help countries develop, and provide infrastructure for sustainable peace. So GATT's founders aimed to underwrite peace and security by creating a multilateral trading system. So the WTO encompassed and succeeded the GATT in 1995. Peace was not explicitly, or women-related norms were not explicitly referenced in the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO or the launch of Doha Development Round in 2001. So the concept of peace was missing, and women-related norms related to trade, which are crucial to normal functioning of trade, of course, legal trade. So WTO, in what I experienced, was not only not part of peace toolbox when peace and post-conflict economy recovered and negotiated, but also the empowerment of women was missing. So this brought me to the Trade Impact Group under the umbrella of International Trade Center that was led at the time by Arantxa Gonzalez. She later became a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, and nowadays, Paul, she is a Dean of Sciences Po in Paris. So our work resulted in Cyrus in 2017, a ministerial meeting in the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. The declaration established an initiative to remove barriers to women's participation in trade and was supported initially by 180 WTO members and observers. It now, I think, counts for 130 or more signatories. So during the same ministerial conference in 2017, the WTO launched equally important Trade for Peace initiative, I'm still closely following the working group. As you know, Paul, we were both in touch with the WTO with regard to trade for peace and working group activities on women in trade, and I strongly support the trade for peace concept. I teach it twice a year at Colegio de Mexico in collaboration with my great friend, Ambassador Fernando Di Matteo.
So, Doris, let's continue on this path of specific lessons learned or information that we can pull from your 40 years of experience negotiations and public diplomacy. And let's dive into this question of closed door diplomacy and negotiations. You know, in today's universe, so much information is publicly available, is leaked. You have negotiators commenting in quite detail and quite frequently on social media. Talk to us a little bit about the value of good old-fashioned closed-door diplomacy, private negotiations, back-channel negotiations, and the role that this can play in a successful negotiated outcome.
Well, it can still play a decisive role. And of course, we have many examples. But I, as you mentioned, went through some of the events, some closed-door meetings in Washington, D.C., and I witnessed some very important ones. I will give you an example of the meeting of, at that time, President Djukanovic and Deputy Secretary of State Strop Talbot in 1998, after we met with Secretary Albright. The focus of this office call was on the efforts to avert war over Kosovo, over Boris Yeltsin and the Russian position, and also the reasons Strop Talbot shifted his priorities a little bit from the Balkans to India and Pakistan, after India tested a nuclear device in May 1988 without really coordinating or even informing the United States. So he advised Djukanovic to strengthen a new vision for Montenegro so that Milosevic's anticipated fall, as he said, would not be a kiss of death for Djukanovic. It was a fascinating meeting. The other example that stands out is one of Senator Biden, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at that time. One closed-door meeting with Biden, I think, Paul, significantly influenced Djukanovic's course of action regarding Milosevic and Montenegro's overall relations with the US, Serbia, and NATO, probably even, influenced decisively the fate of Montenegro. During their first meeting, when Holbrooke's Dayton Peace Agreement was already in place, Biden told Djukanovic at the closed-door meeting that Milosevic's policy would take him and his cronies to the International Criminal Court. And he said, let's get to the point and get on with it. We don't want to waste time, so let's cut to the chase. He said that Montenegro's leaders' political moves from now on would be measures through their relations with Milosevic. So the message could not be more straightforward. Read beneath the lines, Paul.
If you don't want to go to The Hague, like Milosevic, start to separate now.
Absolutely.
So, Zorica, let me ask you this question, whether you think that diplomacy and negotiations have changed in the age of the internet, either because it's more difficult to do closed-door diplomacy or in other ways that negotiations might have changed because of the prevalence of the internet everywhere.
It seems that the principal, fundamental, traditional functions of diplomats and diplomacy have not changed much in one embassy structure. Representation and protection of the interests of nationals of the sending states, initiation and facilitations of strategic agreements, treaties and conventions, promotion of information, trade and commerce, cultural diplomacy. That's on the surface. What has changed dramatically is technical developments, mainly digitalization, that is profoundly affecting how diplomats work and conduct their business. I will recall again 1999, Paul, with the help of my only team member at that time, I sealed and personally delivered letters to 43 members of the House and 100 senators walking from office to office on a Capitol Hill. The context of my message was my government's plea to members of Congress to save Montenegro from a NATO bombing campaign. This certainly would not be necessary or possible today when you can do all this work with one click from your computer. And as my friend was telling me at that time, save your product from there and there. Or trying desperately at that time to get a hold of anyone in Ambassador Tom Pickering's office in May 1999 after the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the NATO intervention. 5 laser bombs that were dropped by US planes on a NATO raid killed 3 embassy staff and injured 27. I wanted to understand the situation better, as that prompted anti-American demonstration in some parts of the region, including Montenegro. So China immediately suspended discussions on human rights and pulled out of the WTO negotiations. I learned with the delay that he was sent, Ambassador Pickering, to Beijing to negotiate a settlement for damages. Nowadays, you would discover that right away over a Twitter platform. So modern diplomacy is experiencing fundamental changes at an unprecedented rate, which affects the very character of diplomacy, as we know. So these changes also affect domestic and international politics that were once of, I think, not a great concern to diplomacy. So the number of domestic and international actors whose activity implicates diplomacy is increasing: citizens, NGOs, mayors. So the public is more sensitive to foreign policy issues and seeks to influence diplomacy through social media. So digital diplomacy and social channels have become essential tools for diplomacy in any country. And in the world of changing geopolitical power facilitated by the internet, the question is how we adjust statecraft now. Do we choose to be quiet and weak, or loud and advanced foreign policy using social media in the toolbox? And I want to clarify that closed-door diplomacy, this private negotiation, is still essential to diplomacy. We engage publicly, but we do it in a good old-fashioned. So modern tools do not exclude old-fashioned traditional form of diplomacy. It's not one thing or another. The social platform is one of the tools. And I think European Union and the UN, and of course I see it in the United States, are actively pushing innovative approaches to digital diplomacy. Last year, European Union opened a joint center with the US in San Francisco. I think the World Economic Forum is supporting it fully to tackle this, and part of it is how to fight the Russian war propaganda machine. And what is particularly interesting is that the UN Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs already has an artificial intelligence algorithm for communicating with constituency in the conflict zones, developing a real-time feedback for high-level UN negotiations. So, yes, what I already see is a shift in both bilateral diplomacy and multilateral fora. What I wanted to say is that all these tools, I think, Paul, are not enough for the small countries. I think their success will also depend on their ability and competence to anticipate future risks and all the moving parts of international politics.
Yeah. And artificial intelligence is just going to complicate this arena even more so, but also provide some opportunities maybe for some, more innovative approaches to building peace and resolving conflict. Let me switch from the artificial intelligence end of the spectrum over to the humanistic dimension. As a diplomat, you've represented your state's strategic interests, but you're also a human being and you have your own perspectives and beliefs and opinions. How did you balance, or did you have to balance, were you required at times to balance any ethical dilemmas between the strategic interests of your state and your own ethics and ideals?
Absolutely. That's the most complicated question, Paul, because as a diplomat, what we call a symbolic representative of states, diplomatic agents face challenges regarding different vulnerabilities and demands that reflects multi-ethnic societies, cultural sensitivities, some domestic policy issues, and trends in very complex international relations. And the problems of acting on behalf of others pertain to the changing nature of principles. So the difference, for example, in representing democratic and authoritarian states and the specific complications associated with internally divided states and or populist regimes. So those are the problems that Kofi Annan used to call problems without passport.
Yes.
So the specific case of dilemmas regarding representation in 21st century occurs in dividing society, and that's exactly not only Montenegro, but nowadays United States and most part of Europe. So two prominent examples are Great Britain after the Brexit referendum and the United States after the election of Donald Trump as president. I witnessed the Brexit transition in the membership of the UK within the WTO, how British diplomacy consolidated and took back its chair in the WTO in a record time was impressive. I remember some US ambassadors and diplomats in Geneva resigning immediately after Trump's victory. In contrast, others requested the regular extension, only to find out that they were asked to return to Washington on Christmas Day. So my country's diplomacy, Montenegro, is facing severe challenges. The new government took over, a new narrative with diverse political options that are more included regarding diplomatic representations because of the latest reality, and the reality is new political landscape in our parliament and the government. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is transitioning after 30 years of Djukanovic's diplomacy in a sharply divided society. The complexity comes when the countries are politically split into kind of two halves of similar strength, with opposing views on issues the diplomats have to deal with. On the one hand, this would seem to grant diplomats more levy. On the other hand, the lack of firm and consistent policies, standpoints, and even instructions complicates life for diplomats significantly. So the lack of firm consensus can be a severe liability in international negotiations, as the other side may try to exploit internal divisions and opposing standpoints. So one familiar dynamic, well known from, I think, repeated Cold War occurrences, because we are in some kind of visions that reminds us or reflects the Cold War, is that hardliners on both sides tend to reinforce each other's position. And then how about the situation when you have another specific difficulty concerning the rise of populist regimes? That's another challenge. Populism yields a democratic representation problem. Populists claim to represent the real people or the silent majority. So by implication, those who do not share the populist views and the nation of their own notion of the people might not be legitimate members of society. So populism is a contrary to coexistence, to live and let live, on which democracy and diplomacy rests. So I find this, Paul, as the most challenging question.
Well, Zorica, let me pick up on that and let me ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, which is, what skills have you found most useful in addressing those types of challenging questions or some of the other challenges that you faced in diplomacy and in negotiations? What is it that some of our listeners should be thinking about in terms of skills that they should either develop or that they should hone?
Well, for the first part of your question, Paul, let me tell you that my constant issue as a diplomat, interacting with ordinary people, but even with the officials in the host country, was explaining where the country I represented was. So going back to the basic geography, Paul, even during my official trip to India in 2017 as ambassador of Montenegro, I spent 30 minutes entering and leaving India in front of the passport officer who could not find my country on the list and declared she never heard of it. In another two instances, two high officials, one from the World Bank in Geneva and the other minister of the French government in 2004, confused Montenegro with Macedonia. So it was always important to me to make sure that my interlocutors, official or informal, were familiar with the new country of Montenegro, to put Montenegro on the map. I learned early on that diplomats should never assume that colleagues, diplomats, have all the information and know the specifics. So I found that diplomacy is repeating the story, constantly advocating for your cause, and always explaining your country's position. I recall vividly my encounter with Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois in one of the elevators in Congress in 2004. I introduced myself because meeting Senator Dick Durbin, oh, I have opportunity. And to my surprise, he said, "You are the first person from Montenegro I have ever met. So tell me something about your country," he said. So I had my 40-second elevator pitch. And when the elevator stopped, he greeted me and said, "I got it, independence, independence, independence." So on the other side, and equally important, do not ever try to fake your way through a conversation in Washington. The likelihood of talking to a world-renowned expert in the field is very high. So especially when it comes to the world affairs. So the second skill, and this one is more practical and based on my recent experience in multilateral fora, when you work and negotiate in the UN and its affiliations or the WTO, you quickly realize that one of the most crucial knowledge you need for the everyday work is knowing the rules of procedures and knowing the system and infrastructure, UN legal history of the subject matter, including specific language lines that members agreed upon in resolutions. For example, if you are negotiating a new resolution of human rights in Myanmar, you have to go back to some old, already agreed upon resolutions from the time of the rule of military dictatorships from 1962 and maneuver the update based on already agreed language to generate more support of the membership. Then if you want to incorporate sanctions and arms embargo, you have to be very careful what you ask for, mainly if your goal is to return to status quo before the coup. So likewise, during the discussion in the Working Council or any of the 6 bodies of the UN, knowing specifics and procedures help you to participate effectively, shift the debate, slow down and interrupt or speed up the process and request clarification or explanation of the what. And to my surprise, Paul, I learned and experienced that Cuba has the most capable legal team in Geneva and New York, of course, after the US and UK and probably Egypt. And this is despite their record in violation of human rights. So they stand firm in legal procedural knowledge. And my first thought and explanation was, well, multilateral is their terrain, is their, space. They see that as the only chance to have their voice heard. The country's position is much weaker in bilateral interactions for apparent reasons. I also learned from my colleague that Cuban diplomats undergo special training for 2 years before being posted to the UN and other multilateral organizations, out of which 6 months is intensive training in rules of procedures. So that's an interesting practical skill. The third skill is to keep your Rolodex ready. Keep in touch, maintain your network, reach out to exchange information and share opportunities. Networks distribute influence and power across traditional boundaries, allowing powerful interest group to form and re-inform rapidly. So the networks are flexible and can constantly reconfigure themselves to address new challenges. It will enable ideas to compete and be the most able to share and receive the relevant information. So yeah, keep in touch.
So know your rules, keep in touch, and have your elevator speech ready. Because you never know when you'll actually be in an elevator and can use your elevator speech. Well, Zorica, let me wrap up with one last question. And I like to ask this question of all of my guests. What is your key takeaway that you want our listeners to remember and to recall? And let me ask specifically in this 3 key principles that have guided you in your approach to diplomatic engagement and that our listeners should think about adopting as they move forward with peace negotiations or diplomatic engagement or other types of conflict or peace building related opportunities.
Sure. In response to this question, Paul, I'm thinking about the diplomatic principles focusing on operational level, the level in foreign policy communities where practitioners plan, design, and conduct diplomacy to achieve objectives in the strategic national interest. So the operational level of foreign policy is essential for formulating diplomatic approaches to international challenges, diplomatic negotiations and mediation. So the fact is that complex arenas of bilateral and multilateral engagements for the countries have changed. Diplomatic engagements and principles of the US has changed since the 2011 terrorist attack. Montenegro's operational level of foreign policy has changed after independence or after the NATO membership, resulting in several new efforts to set up and describe principles to reflect this new reality. I'm sure the principles will continue to evolve and adjust to the state's interests and society's contemporary challenges. So my principles have always been optimism, a commitment to justice, truth in dealing, and realism. But I would also agree with former Secretary of State and Defense Colin Powell on principles of diplomacy and negotiations. He said, power is a prerequisite, but that is not enough in diplomacy. Then it is better to have more partners on your side than against you. I certainly try to build more partners for Montenegro. And incomplete victories, he said, that give an opponent a way out are often the best solutions. So principles that are open to solutions and conclusions. Based on these principles, Paul, that I just laid out, my century in DC was an extraordinary journey. And being an active participant in Montenegro's political evolution with the support of the US and the 3 presidents in the White House, it was my honor.
Well, Zorica, it's been my honor and my privilege to have you on our program. I've really enjoyed our conversation. As our listeners can tell, you and I have been friends for decades. And it's great to have this opportunity to remind ourselves and our listeners of all of the amazing things that you've done with so many different hats and so many different challenges. And for you to be so willing to candidly share your life lessons, the lessons that you've learned about diplomacy and peace building and negotiations. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this time to share your perspectives and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me, Paul.